Everyone. I'm going to get started because I have the pleasure of introducing Gyan, and I have a very long introduction for him, which he probably doesn't need for everyone that is here. But I want to still go through with it because I want, and I had said this to Gyan earlier, which is an opportunity for us to have him think through this book in light of the long durée of ideas he has been thinking and working with, rather than us going straight to the book. I think many of us here have hopefully had a chance to look at the book or read some parts of the book, and we'll have questions thereof, but to set us off in terms of longer durée of work. And one could say, I was thinking in terms of the long durée, nearly half a century of scholarship when I discovered that your first book was published in 1978. So it's an extraordinary pleasure to have Gyan Pandey here with us. I think you all know about his enormous influence in South Asian historiography, and particularly as part of the Subaltern Studies collective through the decades that group shaped and the discipline for not just South Asia, but also thinking about post-colonial worlds writ large. And for me personally, much of his work has been a touchstone, a provocation, an invitation to question fundamental categories of my inquiry. So that first book in 1978, The Ascendancy of the Congress in Uttar Pradesh, 1926 to 34, explored the uneven reach of Indian nationalism and the limits of political mobilization. At the time, in 1979, the American Historical Review wrote of the book in comparing it to the work of Eric Hobsbawm for its close attention to the social and the political, as well as the beauty of its writing. And it was hugely important for a long time for understanding why the Congress had failed to gain the support of Muslims in particular in UP at this very crucial juncture in Indian history. You can already see in this work questions that explode as part of the Subaltern Studies collective's work, critiquing the elitism and exclusions of liberal nationalism, and a systemic interrogation of the epistemic violence of the colonial archive, which would result in, of course, the landmark work, The Construction of Communalism in Colonial North India. I suspect and hope that pretty much everyone here has read some part of it. Not only did it challenge communalism as a timeless feature of Indian society, but argued that it was a specifically colonial form of knowledge meant to displace the colonial state's own violence onto the colonized, and one that would also, in effect, shape Indian nationalism itself. That the form of Indian nationalism came to be forged by casting communalism as its other. And the effect of this work could be found then not just in South Asian history writing, but also African and Latin American historical work. It was a few years after this work that I was in a seminar with Gyan. It was an extraordinary graduate seminar, only about 4 of us reading texts very carefully. And what I remember of it It was a particularly joyously provocative probing that was strikingly grounded at every moment of its theoretical ruminations. And it impacted my own work in ways which are maybe quite obvious. He was working at the time on the Partition of 1947, lineaments from the previous work on the failure of Congress nationalism to bring Muslims into its fold, as well as communal violence, and most importantly, the problem of writing about violence itself is noteworthy. This problem of writing about violence, Gyan perhaps first articulated in defense of a fragment, writing about Hindu-Muslim violence in India today, which in its first iteration came out in 1991, where he wrote, "The history of violence is written up in the historiography of modern India as aberration and as an absence. Aberration in the sense that violence is treated as something removed from the general run of India, of Indian history, its distorted form, its exceptional moment, not its real history at all. Absence, because historical discourse has experienced great difficulty in capturing, in representing the moment of violence." His work, Remembering Partition, Violence, Nationalism, and History in India, as well as Routine Violence, Nations, Fragments, and Histories. One came out in 2001, the other in 2006, and which included an iteration of In Defense of the Fragment, theorized with fragments and the nation as a subject of history, with most importantly representation, writing about violence and its attendant amnesia, erasure, and displacements that structured the everyday affairs, that structured social life writ large. Today we are reading Men at Home, and discussing Men at Home, which begins with fragments of a family. And so we return to fragment, as Gyan writes in this iteration, both a part of and an interruption, an indication of the significance of thinking with the fragment that I hope we will hear more elaboration with. As we turn to Men at Home, I want to add, and I think this is maybe also a direction that I hope our conversation will take us today, that Gyan has been an important interlocutor of post-colonial thought across the North-South divide, the US and India. And this has included a number of anthologies which have thought with subaltern across this space, with history of prejudice, race, caste, and difference, and the politics of democracy, which came out in 2013 as part of it. Across these works, Pandey has insisted on a fragmentary ethical historiography, attentive to silence, attentive to dissent and difference, as well as the routine and the ordinary. Men at Home, Imagining Liberation in Colonial and Postcolonial India came out earlier this year. Gyan will speak to the book at hand, and following his introduction to the text, Denise Davis here and I will raise some questions, and I hope all of you will too, I think some of you having read the text in particular, to raise questions regarding it and in relation to these lines of inquiry in his longue durée of scholarship. Denise Davis directs the graduate program in gender and sexuality at the Pembroke Center for Research and Teaching on Women, and is a longtime editor of its flagship journal called Differences, a journal of feminist cultural studies. Her own research explores the relation of the popular theorizations of gender to psychoanalytical concepts of sexual difference. So with further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Gyan, to speak of the genealogy of the book and lay out some of its important.
Thank you. Is it okay if I sit and talk? I may need to stand up and walk later, but for the moment. After an introduction like that, the best response would have been silence. Because it's generous. Thank you very much. What Wazira didn't say is I'm not yet 100 years old. I'm getting there. And perhaps I should add that first book was finished when I was 24. And it has the, what should we say, merits and the demerits of a book written by somebody who's in his early 20s and knew very little about Indian history, let alone about anything else. There was rapid fire, there was a series of accidents that led me to finish my PhD very early and to write a book. It was published very early.
And to such stunning plot at the
and
time.
It's always heartening, heartwarming to have responses. There was something that touched a chord, as I hope there's something in this book too that might touch a chord. That seems to be touching a chord in some places anyway. The longue durée is a difficult one to speak about because you actually don't know how it happened. And you look back and you see it differently. So what I'm going to say today is not how things happened. This is how I see things today and try to make sense of it. And in that sense, probably the best thing to say is that I grew up at a time when it was, I went to college in Delhi, at a time when the Indian Revolution, so to speak, the liberation struggle, had run aground in some ways. And there was all kinds of serious challenges to that. Most prominently for students and teachers of a liberal, progressive inclination, the extreme left was very, very important. And so we all grew up with Naxal slogans, China's chairman is our chairman, these sorts of things, the belief in the Cultural Revolution, all sorts of things, as part of our inheritance and part of our inspiration. Mm. And the result was that a number of us in Calcutta, as well as Delhi, as well as other places, I'm sure, but Calcutta and Delhi particularly, worked on the peasants in the countryside and their politics. And so willy-nilly, almost without thinking about it, we challenged a view not only of politics, but of history, which excluded those sorts of people from its ambit. And that's really what's developed a lot over time. Not conceptualized in that way. As I say, it was an accident. It was a critique of the things that were being done, how they'd be done, why they'd run aground, what was missing. Those were the questions. Probably the best way to think about the longue durée for me is in terms of a question I'm often asked, and I have been asked, especially since the Race and Caste book, the Race, Caste and Difference in India and the United States. A question, especially in the United States, but it's asked by academics everywhere. How did you get from there to here? Right? From communalism, concerned with all of that, writing about partition, writing about peasants. How did you come to write about race and caste? What's next? This was kind of eclectic in the West kind of way. And for those who know Hindi Urdu and know their Bollywood, I'll say, in my mind, the response was always, "Samajhne wale samajh gaye hain, na samjhe," which means that those who want to see a thread will see the thread. Those who see what's common will see it. But those who don't see it won't see it. And Here's, I think, the thread that has concerned most of us. Feminist historiography, anti-colonial historiography, borderlands historiography today, all kinds of people, Dalits writing in India today, African-American historiography. All of this African historiography was all about the histories that were not recognized as histories. The histories of the peoples without history, as Hegel put, right? And so the Africans had to produce oral histories of an extraordinary kind to demonstrate that you could actually have history without writing, so-called, without the written archive in the way in which people. Anyway, this, it seems to me, is what was driving much of our work. And as I say, this is a very wide spectrum of people working, not just those doing subaltern studies. We were just a small part of what was happening very, very widely and has continued to happen. But therefore, the peasants were a starting point where the proposition, Subaltern Studies' first proposition, is they're not pre-political. The peasants are political. The peasants are modern. The peasants are part of the making of modernity in India, right? And they're very much part of the citizenship and the history of this country, and it must be entertained. And marginalized and subordinated groups of all kinds, minorities, Muslims amongst them, Dalits, these were all part of the same endeavor, thinking these histories, which has not been recognized as histories, which had not even been recognized as knowledge. What do they know, right? The poor in general, what do they know, right? They haven't been educated. They need to be educated into citizenship. And the left was guilty of this too. The left too was waiting for the working class to emerge with its working class consciousness. We educate the people into that consciousness. So in a sense, all of these, and I'm not suggesting we knew what we were doing. In retrospect, I can see that is the thing that was connecting all of it. And the way in which I've come to conceptualize it or write about it and think about it is as an exercise in unarchived histories. And I don't know, you may have read it. I have a collection which I published with an essay in it, an essay that had appeared earlier in EPW, in Economic and Political Weekly in Bombay, called Unarchived Histories. And the subtitle is The Mad and the Trifling. Okay. And I won't go into that in full. But unarchived histories has two dimensions which seem to me important. The point I made in that article was unarchived histories are not histories without an archive. They are histories that have been deliberately excluded from the record, excluded from the domain of history. And their archive has been inadmissible. Right? They are deliberately unarchived. They are a consequence of political decisions, if you like, made by academics as well as by others, because there was a kind of inheritance of what history should be, which is you go to an archive and it's all there, and you do 1890 to 1905, and then you do 1905 to 1915, the next step, and so on and so forth. And there was a lot of history done that way. But it was, you needed the authoritative record to produce it. Well, where do the poor have the authoritative record? Where do the marginalized and the oppressed? Where do women? This is what feminist historiography opened up so fundamentally, so radically, that they changed what counted as history. But, and perhaps this wasn't emphasized enough, they changed at the same time necessarily what counted as the archive. Very, very important. And therefore, the unarchived histories becomes an investigation of what the archive is. And in that, the one way I put it in my classes all of the time, and I think I've written it either in this book now or in any event, in the Hindi version of it, which I'm writing, I say now that the archive is our questions. That's as radical a departure as I can, as I could make of what counts as archive, which is not a repository, not a big library where government records are kept, etc. But the same material is a different archive if you go to it with different questions, which is exactly what postcolonial scholarship, anti-colonial scholarship that has been produced by the marginalized and so on, all of this radical scholarship and Subaltern Studies in my own work contributed to that in some ways. And so it's not surprising that I should have moved from thinking about peasants and thinking about what happened in the Hindu-Muslim community. I should perhaps say one other thing, which I say in this book quite categorically. But I grew up in an India, like people grow up in whatever country, whatever location they're in, with things that were hidden, things you were aware of, things that bothered you, but that were not openly discussed. And certainly from not primary school, but maybe secondary school days on, I was consciously aware of my sense of being unhappy that these weren't discussed. They were not addressed. So caste existed and everybody kind of talked about it or recognized it. But this was a thing of the past. It was going to disappear. It was antique. It was antiquated. And so casteism was never taken seriously. It was there everywhere. You walked out of a home and you met the sweepers who shrank against a wall to make sure they didn't touch you. Right? And this is the rich and poor divide, basically expressing itself in hundreds and hundreds of different ways. But casteism, racism, anti-minority, those who don't fit, who are not the norm, who are not the majority, who are not us. Right? This was very much a part of the nationalism, the society, the country we were living in, we were growing in. And that papering over was something that bothered me. And so from the beginning, with the thing on peasants, happened because of the kind of political things that were happening around. But the question of Hindu-Muslim conflict, antagonism, making of Pakistan, the fundamental thing that communalism somehow was seen as not our real history. Nationalism was our real history. Communalism was what the others did. Jinnah did it, or some baddies did it, whatever it was. So my book on communalism, fundamentally, what did it say? These are the same thing. Communalism is another version of nationalism. It's a different version. You've got to take it on. And that's the only way in which to fight for the good society that you're talking about. It's not given to us in India. And the book on partition, what was divided? Partition was one thing, violence was another. So what does the book say? The violence is partition. Nothing else. It is not that partition causes violence or violence caused partition, as a partition is something, really, literally, then it amounts to saying it's a line on a map. My God, any of us who've had anything to do with South Asia, know it's a great deal more than that. And it's affected families, it's affected individuals, it's affected the way in which people are constructed. It's produced the politics of today in all sorts of extraordinary ways, as similar experiences and similar inheritances have produced in other countries. This country, elsewhere in the world, right? And so those were logical moves, in a sense. Thinking unarchived histories the whole way. Thinking they have been deliberately unarchived. How? In what way? By marginalizing what? So you marginalize the minority as traitors, or as suspect citizens. They actually want to be somewhere else, but they happen to be here and they can't help it, therefore they're here. You marginalize violence for whatever reason. It's not our history. We're such a wonderful, non-violent people. Look at us. We're so tolerant. We welcome everybody. There's stories, nations, and powers that be tell to themselves. And we were investigating unarchived history. And so I better not take too long. This is the real danger of asking me to speak. Longue durée, she says. The real danger is I'm an academic, I'm South Asian, and I'm a South Asian male. So it's 3 times compounded. I could just go on forever. And I better stop before it's too late. But I'll say a little bit about this book just in that context. So the question really that might arise in this context about the Men at Home book is, well, how's that been unarchived? What do you call that an unarchived history? What's unarchived here? And there are different parts to this. One is, hasn't it always? We all know this. It's been written about. What's new? Right? That's part of the thing. And all sorts of feminist scholarship, all sorts of wonderful scholars have actually addressed these questions. They have. So what is it that you're talking about being unarchived? And what's the archive that you think that you've got to pay attention? And I'll try and answer those 2 questions just very briefly. What's unarchived here is men, right? So in what sense are they marginalized? Well, they're not marginalized. What's unarchived is their history of privilege, which the unarchiving and the removal from the domain of history produces. So there is not a history, as far as I could see, and I think many people have suggested that is so, there is not a history of the men in the home. Tell us about what happens when you spend most of your time in industrial and post-industrial society in this domestic space and depend on it in all sorts of ways. So the big book begins with the proposition. There is a presence-absence of men. And that presence-absence is the object of inquiry. That presence-absence and the rhetoric surrounding it, what justifies it. And what justifies it is world history and the history of the everyday, which I end with. But in any event, that's the thing. The archive, well, there is no archive for this because, of course, men are not meant to be in that domestic space. So they tell us. As I say, they spend most of their time there and they depend on it entirely. But the archive, if you think of the visual of the domestic, is always women and children. And so the book had to begin almost kind of rudely saying, let's change the visual of the domestic. Men belong here. They are here. Indeed, they rule here. And they rule here in part by this presence-absence. So that they're not absent even when they're present. They're not present. They're absent even when they're present. And they're not absent. They're not unpresent even when they're absent. In both instances, their authority looms over the house. And so I begin with a little thing about my father's, court, which was part of the household. And what a difference it made when he entered the house. How the entire atmosphere changed. And it's not all homes that are like that. Not all homes have authoritarian fathers. But all homes in some way or other reflected that. I mean, I had uncles and relatives of all kinds because, they're all relatives in the neighborhoods in South Asia. Who were kind on the face of it, who were not as, what should we say? My father was a writer. He was a civil servant. He was the first person out of the village. He was the first person who wore trousers. He was the first person who spoke English. And he thought of himself as a bit of an Englishman. He also thought of himself as this great writer. So when he came to England, when I was studying there, he wanted to be a photograph taken in front of Anne Hathaway's cottage in Stratford. This was part of the image of himself. Not all my uncles and so on were like that. But there was this commonality. They were not there. They did not need to be there. It wasn't that. And so what's the archive? And there's any amount of writing by those same people, usually focusing entirely on the public world, in which there's a paragraph somewhere, or sometimes stray references to the domestic space, to the birth of a child, to the death of a child, stray remarks. Nonetheless, they're there. And you have in someone like Premchand, the greatest Hindi Urdu writer of the early part of the 20th century, up to the 1930s. He died in 1936. You have in Premchand one paragraph about his domestic life. One paragraph, which is written the year before he dies, in English, in a letter to somebody who's writing about him and wants a response to certain questions. But Premchand has produced hundreds of novels, huge amounts of writing work, which speaks about all of the time. And then his second wife writes a book from which the title of this book comes. He writes a book called Premchand Ghar Mein, Premchand in the Home. And so the Hindi version of this book is called Hindustani Admi Ghar Mein. Because that's where I got the idea. This is an appropriate tag. It makes the point. And Shivrani Devi's account, Shivrani Devi Premchand, his second wife, her account of that domestic life is so remarkably, radically different from anything he says. The very tone of it, it's almost like he couldn't write that in Hindi or Urdu. He wrote it in English. There's something interesting that there too. Yeah? Hamare Mister, Hamari Mrs. कह रही थी. There's something comes in which you can say in English, which you can't say in Hindi, Urdu, Marathi, whatever it may be, which is strange. But nonetheless, there are all kinds of euphemisms. And so it may be that even the language in which he wrote that one paragraph, but there is a colossal amount. Harvansh Rai Bachchan, whom I write about, has a 4-volume autobiography. And it's a really, really intimate story of all his life and loves. I have a lot to say about what these stories are, because at the beginning of my list of characters, I say, you may notice that the autobiographies themselves are characters in this book. Because in fact, they are different characters than the people who thought they were writing their own stories. Okay. And I think that matters. There's some quite interesting things, very interesting questions about that. In any event, it's that. And one other instance, Rahul Sankrityayan writes a 6-volume autobiography, which is like a diary. He maintains a daily diary, and it's rather like that diary reproduced. And it's extraordinarily detailed. It's full of anguish in places. It's full of guilt in places. It's a remarkable record of his life outside the home and inside the home, with this peculiar belief that he didn't need to be in the home. He didn't need the home. His work was all somewhere else. And he was this world transformer. He was. He was a remarkable, extraordinary scholar with an extraordinary achievement in rescuing Buddhism and the study of Buddhism to the extent that he did. And so on, also to one. Anyway, so the book comes out. If you want, I'll go on, but otherwise I probably said enough about where this is located. I can say a bit more about the content of this book if you want. Otherwise, I'll leave it to questions. I think that's
a little brief framing of the content of the book would be helpful.
Okay.
Otherwise,
I don't mind, as I say. I mean, the South Asian male academic, you're really giving license. So, with apologies, it's her fault, not mine. Now, as I said, I begin with that proposition about presence-absence and the rhetoric surrounding it. What justifies a presence-absence of this kind, makes it and reproduces it. Because in the most remarkable way, one of the things that happens in colonial and post-colonial India is the reproduction of patriarchy along those lines. In fact, in some ways, a deepening of it, a kind of an entrenchment of it, which these days has become even more lethal. I mean, it's gone wild in all sorts. So you can see what extremist chauvinist nationalism can produce. It produces a stepping backwards, which has taken away everything that the women's struggle, that working people's struggles, that the struggle for the welfare state, all of this produced over the last 100 and 150 years back. Right? All the ideas of modernity and secularism and revolution and change and the good society. You have a very different world now. The good society is a submissive woman as much as anything else. So in any case, that is the changing of the visual, and that particular focus, I say right at the beginning, I want to firmly put these men back in that space and investigate what they said to one another, what they did in that space. And then I do a whole variety of things. This is going to be important right at the end of the book. I'm going to say it in a moment. But I do a whole variety of things, just paying close attention to what they did in the home. The things they touched, the things they did not, they refused to touch. And the ways in which they touched the things that they touched. Right? Beds. You sleep on them. You don't make them. You don't clean them. Women, what do you do with them? You need them physically. You need them sexually. You don't touch their emotion. And the evidence, the poor, the working people in the homes, but you need them desperately. You don't touch them at all. They do all the dirty work, as do the women. You are there. The working class people, I discovered, amongst the working classes, you wouldn't expect this at all. Amongst the working classes, amongst the Dalits, the lowest of the low, the most oppressed castes and classes, you would find the men and women are all working out in the public square, trying to earn money for the thing, as well as in the home. They're working all the time. The men are not working in the home quite the same way, not with that same sort of thing. But here's something that really struck me as very strange. The men would go so far as to help with shopping and with cutting the vegetables. They would never cook. You think, what's going on there? And same men, some of them, when they became fairly well known, they would be great chefs. They would cook on occasion the special dish that had to be cooked. Ambedkar does this on one occasion. Takes 7 hours to prepare a meal where no doubt he left a huge mess all around for everybody else to clear up. Right? So there's very peculiar notions of the things you touch and the things you don't touch. And just in the end of the book, I try to draw an inventory, and I say, this is an impossible task. But let's begin. Let's give it a shot. Okay. But there are other things that they do, which are quite remarkable. In the first part of the book, the very first part of the book is called Legacies. And all it is a kind of a statement to my colleagues that I know there's been a lot of work. Don't imagine that I'm just saying, everything we hear is new. I know there's been a huge amount of work. But some things have been missing, or some things have not been focused in the way in which I think they should have been. And that's what I will do in this book. They are about historiographical and historical legacies. Both are important in that first part. There are 2 chapters. One is legacies of the kinds of houses people lived in, including the working poor who did not have 4 walls around them. So what are the houses they live in? What's the home? Right? So there are 2 chapters of that kind. Then I have a section called Practices, in which the first one is called Duty, first chapter. Second chapter is called Discipline, and the third chapter is called Dignity. Now, duty is a rather important chapter. It was, in fact, the first piece that I wrote for this book, and I wrote it in Hindi in a long essay. I had never written an academic essay in Hindi before. I had written journalistic pieces. But the editor of a Hindi journal in Delhi said to me, Gyan, please write something original in Hindi. Don't translate. Write it in Hindi. And because I was doing all this work in Hindi, Urdu, autobiographies, Marathi autobiographies, I felt this is appropriate. I'm addressing an audience that knows this material. Let me write it in Hindi. In any case, the thing that comes out in that particular chapter is the way in which these remarkable leaders, amongst whom now there's Gandhi and Ambedkar as well, but there was Rajendra Prasad, Premchand, Rahul Sankrityayan primarily in the first iteration. These remarkable leaders had to lift the idea of work to a place of dignity, because traditionally the well-to-do, the comfortable, the respectable, the ashraf and the bhadralok, they did no work. That was the sign of your status, that you didn't ever do any physical work. So farming itself was, you might own huge lands, but you never farmed, right? It was others who did this. Partly because iron was polluting as well. Right? There are all kinds of things that are polluting. You can understand blood and shit being polluting, but all sorts of other things are polluting too. Clothes are polluting, of course, washing clothes. But anyway, these people, and they worked at this to lift the thing of work outside the home, work teaching even, right? Work for an income to the level of something that was respectable, more than respectable. It was dharma. It was duty. It was swadharma, except that it was not religiously appointed, religiously given. It wasn't laid down in the Shastras. It was self-chosen. And I make the point that there is no word for calling or profession in Hindi Urdu. It's very striking. But these people managed to lift the idea of work to this respectability, made it something that these generations, the late 19th century, early 20th century, were already committed to. We have a new dharma, which is changing the world, producing the good society in the here and now, not in the hereafter. Yet, those same people took the home for granted. It had nothing to do with all of this. There was no physical labor in the home, not by the poor, not by the women, nor not by anything else. We need to do this great work, but we do it somewhere else. Domestic spaces, it's just there. It's like mountains and trees and rivers and so on. Background, right? You do your work. So that's what the chapter on duty does. The chapter on discipline is an interesting one. It's a group that I call the Partition and Independence generation. People who grew up a little before that. Many of people I write about migrated to Pakistan. They were professionals in the main, and a poet, Bachchan. But these people speak non-stop about the discipline they need in the home, the discipline they need of themselves, and the discipline they need to teach the country, the society, to make India and Pakistan the sort of countries, modern, secular, liberal, progressive, the good society that we have dreamed of. And discipline was very important in that, in a quite extraordinary way, because they're not disciplined themselves at all. Most of them, they're undisciplined. It's the most remarkable. But the dharma is discipline, especially for others. And dignity is I turn, for various reasons, you can't write about everything in India And you don't want to convey, especially to non-South Asianists, that India is some flat homogeneous mass, which, the subcontinent, India, Pakistan. When I say India, it's because I'm writing about British India as well as post-partition India. That India is some homogeneous place where you can talk about what the family is, what the middle class means, etc., etc. It isn't. We know that. And so the least I could do, and I did it, was to choose the elite Muslims and the elite Hindus as two groups that I would address, partly because they've written so much about their own lives, including the women, which helped. But then I wanted to also address the vast majority of the working people of the country. And so I write about Dalits, because there has been a major cultural movement and an achievement and a huge amount of autobiographical writing, which is different because it is not centered on the individual. It is centered on the community, very directly, almost always. These are autobiographies that, in the words of Baby Kamle, for example, but others too, these are socio-biographies. They are the biography of my community, the autobiography of my community. And in that, respectability has a different meaning from what it has in those other places. Respectability here is dignity, is self-respect. We must build our self-respect. Is education to produce that possibility. And education is a remarkable, absolute wand. It's a central thing, piece here. That education is what will liberate, not us. We lived through a time when there was no escape. But our children, they have a real possibility. And this was the achievement of a post-colonial India. Actually, so much did happen, especially in Kerala, especially in Bengal to some extent, but in many places. Altogether, it was part of it. But that respectability is reinterpreted completely. And dignity and domestic space, and what it means, what the community is, all of that comes across differently, nonetheless, with the things that men will not do certain kinds of things. Even in that condition, even in those conditions, even with those kinds of struggles. And the women are contributing so often as much or more than the men, because they're there all the time. They look after the children all the time. The men actually, partly for labor, they go away, they go into the big cities, they go whatever, they go overseas. But anyhow, that's the middle part. And then I have a conclusion, the last one. And that's the only thing I want to say. Even she had to stop me finally. The last part is called History in a Visceral Register. And I just want to mark that because, in fact, I think that's the one little departure that this book might have made, which had not been made before, which is, I say, world history, world-shattering events, wars, conquests, the making of new nations, etc., etc., as opposed to the history of the everyday labor, the reproduction of a family, the reproduction of ourselves, the reproduction of a community, everyday labor for that, which is the real history. Which history should count as history? Which is the incidental? And I put it to you that world history is the incidental. Every day, the history of the everyday is the necessary, is the thing we should pay attention to. And so history in a visceral register, getting back to the archive, what's the archive? And I didn't realize I'd already said this in my so I just marked one page and then read you something. In my Race and Caste book, where I talk about the history of prejudice, okay? After I'd finished this book, History in a Visceral Register, and any number of people said to me, what do you mean? Isn't that just affect? Isn't it this? What do you mean even by how does it feel to be there? Which is what I'd written. What does all that mean? I said, look, asking the question is a start. As far as I'm concerned, you ask the question, how does it feel to be there? And you're on your way. The archive will open up, right? But then I saw in Benjamin's writing, which once again I had read many, many times, Benjamin leaning on Bertolt Brecht and leaning on Kafka, says what they emphasized was gestures, gestural history. So history in a visceral register is a gestural history. It is a history that pays attention to gestures more than to language, more than to what is said or written. Okay? And I only went back to it because I attended to this thing, writing the Hindi version. I was thinking to myself, how do I translate all of this into a Hindi? Not translate, how do I write it in Hindi? And I saw that in my History of Prejudice, I had written how, out of what archive are we to write a history of gestures so deep-rooted that they may not be noticed even by the perpetrator. Mm. And then I'm quoting, apologies, I'm quoting myself. Okay, so the gestures, the examples I gave were the spat out, half suppressed, almost unconscious gesture of disdain, contempt, and disgust, the pause and the recoil, the refusal to touch what in India is called untouchability. Right? So I had already gestured to the gestural, and that's what I end the book with, saying, what is the necessary? What is the contingent in our thinking, the human past and present? And I do think we need to ask that question. And my apologies for taking so long.
No, I think that gave us landscape from which we can start to interrogate some parts of it, and that will give us another chance to elucidate. I'm going to turn to Denise maybe to ask the question and hold mine for the end, because it'd be also nice to go through and take questions from others thereafter. And if there is time, then I will add mine.
We will make time.
Yes.
We want the questions at least, even if there are no answers.
Well, I was prepared for 3 rounds, and so I'll ask my first one, and I suspect that's as far as we'll get. But you said that I really liked what you said, that peasants are not pre-political. Because as I was reading, I was thinking about the second wave feminist adage of the personal is political, and thinking that Professor Pandey certainly recognized that, but
please call me Gyan.
But the subjects of your book, whom you at one point wryly refer to as our male protagonists, do not seem to recognize that the personal is political. So, first of all, I guess I want to make a comment on the admirable restraint, I would say, with which you approach these our male protagonists. And I confess to moments as a reader of less restraint. I often found myself exasperated with some of these men, with their appeals to the nature of men and women, their aggrandizing sense of purpose at whatever cost, their assumption that their women companions were there to support them. Even when they promoted women's education, it seemed to be self-serving. It was so that their women companions could be better interlocutors, better editors, better typists, and more interesting companions. I also want to register my delight upon finding an epigraph in the last chapter, at the head of the last chapter, from Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, as her work on the masculine aspiration toward what you refer to as world history, or she refers to as transcendence, and the feminine rootedness in immanence as a prominent theme in your book, which I think affirms the old adage, behind every great man is a great woman. So as someone with very little experience of South Asia mores or culture, I was surprised to recognize as much as I did in the ideas that underpin these roles that men and women assume. And I grew up in the USA and Canada, and I found that, in the 60s and 70s, and these ideas of feminine maternity and masculine breadwinning, and women being in secular time and men being in world time, they weren't it did. I guess I expected to find more difference like this. I wanted something more exotic, I think. So my question is, in your extensive reading and research, what did you find that surprised you?
Can I then just add a comment to that, which is to say that I thought the insight was that the making of the modern Indian man and the making of the modern Indian family were in fact very much tied to producing the violence of the domestic sphere, the separation of the private and the public, and producing a certain kind of violence in the domestic sphere was integral to the making of the modern Indian man, such that then, no matter how liberatory one could think of as liberal nationalism or even aspirations for more radical forms of nationalism, no matter what the political framework might be, that therefore the making of the modern Indian man and the modern Indian family were tied to the production of a certain kind of violence in the domestic sphere. And we see that what we now explicitly associate with the rise of Hindu nationalism or rise of a new moment where this is being nationalism, ethno-nationalism writ large, you still see them now asserting that there's a continuity between sort of the architects of liberal nationalism, anti-colonial nationalisms, and this assertion of a vigorous masculine nationalism that we associate with ethno-nationalism of more recent.
Thank you, Ben. Those are important. Difficult question. I want to say about the overly tempered tone. That I do think that they achieved quite remarkable. But yes, even raising work to the level of ethical, the necessary. And Gandhi put it as strongly as that this is literally our duty today. It's world transforming in a world that was full of this kind of comfort and inheritance, and that remains to a very large marked by the fact you must not dirty your hands. You come to the West, you come especially to the United States. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. And you're struck by the fact that people can do so many things with their hands and like to do them, even the men. And that they build their own bookshelves, that they garden in all sorts of ways. Of course, the women do it even more. But this, you don't see it still. So if you're looking for differences, just go over there one time and you will find them. You want to say something, right?
Oh, no, only it wasn't it was the old, the sort of metaphysical understandings of masculinity and femininity that struck me as kind of similar. Not.
No, I understand that. No, I think you saw that. You were wondering about my overly tempered, response and the anger that one feels. And I think you must, one might say that, you see, the number of people, especially men, but older women who read parts of this book, read the Hindi essay extensively, all said, but Gyan, you're writing about another time. It's all changed. They say it categorically. This is no longer true. And yet, it is so fundamentally true that even that struggle to raise physical activity and labor to the level of a respectability has not succeeded, that the values, the mores remain of a different kind of order. And you've got to work with that and, persuade people in some ways. There's not all that different. They'll tell you, women rule today. They run the thing. They run whatever that means. But anyway, that it resonates with your experience in Canada and the USA is important for me to hear. And for us, it seems to me, many people will not read this book outside South Asianists. This is the way the world has been divided, which is fair. Not fair, which is how it is. But I do think, I was struck by the fact that there's an elderly neighbor of ours, a yoga friend, now in her, just turning 90, who was one of the first generation of women to go to Wasa College, remarkably well read, educated, an architect, a PhD, all sorts of things. She read a bit of this. I just shared it with her. I wanted to sponsor. And she said, "Oh, so different from everything we have." That was her first response. And about 4 hours later, the same day, she came back to me and said, "Jan, I've been thinking about it. That's not true. It was just like that. Even when I went to college and so on." So I do think, these things run through in peculiar ways. I think their particularities, the kind of, shall we say, the specificities of the histories that produce certain kinds of reactions, those need to be examined. So what did I find that surprised me? And the question of violence, they both come together in that. One thing that I didn't say, though it will be obvious to many people who know South Asian history to some extent, in the writings on it in recent times, is that the home became the preserve of Indian culture, of the Indian inheritance, which colonialism could not touch. And this created a greater sanctity for this place and made women goddesses, even more than they had ever been before. So the colonial produces the kind of argument that Gandhi makes, but Indian nationalists and nationalists of all kinds were making it all of the time. Islamic, Muslim nationalists were doing it exactly the same. We can learn the things you're teaching. We can learn your science, your military technology. All of that's not a problem. You will never be able to touch the things we have. You will never be able to touch what our community, our spirit, our inheritance, our sacred site have. And this made them far more, as I said, they entrench certain kinds of things. And the violence comes from that to some extent. That you will be, Gandhi says, the future of India lies on your knees. I quote that here. Right, on your knees, not even in your laps. Because you are the makers of the future citizens of this country. And women should have all rights, equal with men. I will never be satisfied until it's exactly the same for everybody. But their primary work is in the home. So you hold those together. And that's part of the violence that comes, because it really is saying, you better study as well. You better do all the things you were just saying, be educated for the reason that then we can go to dances better, or we can, have social conversations better, or whatever else. Or at least I can talk to you about my work properly, But what really marked and surprised me is that masculinity in India was reconstructed in a remarkable Absolutely remarkable. And Gandhi says it once again, quite dramatically, as he said many, many things. Femininity is superior to masculinity, he said, but androgyny is superior to both. And in our inheritance, we have that. We have Narishwar, we have divinity is never masculine or feminine, it's always both. And divinity being both, that is what we have, the kind of image, and just as a symbol, which you will never have. You will never understand. And divinity is present in everything. We don't need a book. It will not teach us. And so what you're getting is a preserve being created, which is a preserve that must really be protected very carefully. And that care requires discipline of all kinds, requires education of all kinds. And what really shocked me in the end is that these remarkably liberal, far-sighted leaders, thinkers, reformers, they're amongst the greatest intellectuals of the 20th century. And Gandhi was talking about the climate disaster in 1909. I mean, he was saying, you're on a path to hell. He wrote this categorically. Technology, machinery is what we do not need. It is the end of our community. It is the end of human being and the environment, the society. That is what human society must be. And I've exaggerated, he got it wrong, they all just. What strikes you most of all, after all of this, after this remarkable perceptive acuity, is their fundamental and unchanging belief that masculinity lay in educating the women, the children, the poor, everybody else. And the education would very often take exactly what you're saying, would take violence. Nothing short of it. It required disciplining those people in the best, in whatever way was necessary. And so Gandhi is brutal with his wife, who was a remarkable companion and comrade. I mean, she was with him in everything, and writes in his autobiography and says it towards the end of his life, I failed in my duty. They were both 13 when they were married. And he says, I failed to educate her when I should have done. And he was brutal in insisting that she does all the things that he demanded. Cleaning the toilets, for example, because he had decided this was part of Swadharma. And she was uncomfortable. And he was brutal with his eldest son because he married a Muslim. Right? This is the most remarkable, one of the most secular people in that country. He was killed for his secular stance. Right? Nonetheless, all of this comes out of him, Rahul Sankrityan. I think you were referring to him when you were saying the young wife who must, study and do her PhD and so on and so forth. And it happened all around. The sign of this new masculinity is educator, much more than virtually anything else. And Shwapna Banerjee actually has a very fine book on this, which is called Fatherhood in the Motherland, or Fathers in the Motherland, which, as I said, she very generously shared with me before it had come out, so that I was able to use some. But the same with Ambedkar. I mean, the kind of violence of his teaching. His first wife, who died in 1936.
Should we take a bunch of questions from the audience? Ashish, Kathleen, and then Ahuna.
Thank you. Reading your book. Thank you, Gyan.
Yeah. Thank you, Gyan. Lovely to hear you talk. I've been reading your work for nearly 30 years. So it's really a pleasure to finally see you. Lots to talk about, lots to do an Adda about, but I just want to specifically ask you a very simple question, is that how do you choose the archive that you choose in this book? Like, why Rahul Sankriva and why Harivansh Rai Bachchan? What and Premchand, for instance, why did you choose these individuals to investigate the fundamental question that you're thinking?
Before you answer, should we take a few more questions as well?
Yeah, so just a very simple question.
Just to make sure we have.
Sure.
Hello. Thank you. I haven't had a chance to read the book, but I look forward to reading all your books. My name is Katyayani.
Katyayani.
Yeah.
Sorry, I said Kathy.
My question was about, is this a history of heterosexual men at home? And when you talk about unarchiving, where does homosexuality come into the domestic space here? Or how does it?
Thank you very much. My name is Ahuna. I'm a graduate student in the anthropology department. I haven't had a chance to read the book as yet because I'm not fortunate enough to be in Wazira's class, but I really look forward to it. These are not men at home, but also great men at home who in their lives and writing are receptive to power and structures of violence. And so one may not be surprised that they might encounter some of their hypocrisies while at home. And so I was wondering if you had a taxonomy here of instances in which this kind of hypocrisy might have been encountered or dealt with by men, or are you saying that it sort of operates entirely subterraneously, this kind of gestural or visceral history? Did you find that it was in any of the cases that these kind of contesting ethics were taken on in speech or life within the domestic?
Yeah, 3 questions to answer.
It's just phrases which it's good if I repeat at least to say that I heard your question, even if I'm not answering it adequately. Okay. How did I choose the protagonists and the archives? Look, I know Hindi, that's good. I know Marathi enough to read. I don't speak it with comfort. I understand a lot. And so I'm limited already, a great deal. I knew some of the Bengali literature from the fact that my colleagues have all worked on it a lot, so I knew it in their writings. So I'm limited to that extent to northern India, central India, and western India. I took on Gujarat because of Gandhi, I write about it. And I took it on because the things happen in Ahmedabad which are happening in Bombay and in Nagpur. And I write about those kinds of structures and housing and so on. And the accident that when I began to do serious research on this, as I say in the book, I actually began thinking about it a long, long time. And I began even jotting down notes of the more egregious things I heard people saying, and behavior, and more egregious forms of it that I saw. When I began to look for material, what do I come across? Rahul Sankriva in 6 huge volumes, 2,500 pages, print. That's his autobiography. Premchand is somebody I'd grown up with. And the grandchildren are my colleagues and friends, very close friends. Rajendra Prasad had written his autobiography. So these were just available. They were the things that spoke very directly to what I was concerned with. But I was concerned to choose a Hindi-speaking or Hindu Bhadralok from these regions, northern, central, western India. And I was concerned to look at Muslim groups from the same regions. And I was advised to some extent. Some friends of mine, Kamran Riyasar in Gelmino, these people told me about some very important autobiographies that come out. I knew Salman Haider, the Indian Foreign Secretary, and I knew about his family. And I knew that his sister, Khurshid Jahan, had actually written an autobiography in English, which was published in newspapers. So this is the accident, in some senses, of the people who are addressing very directly the kinds of questions that I was concerned with, which was, and I said this right at the beginning of the book, I don't want to put this into some words that are forbidding for an ordinary reader. I just want to know how men conducted themselves in the home, what they did from moment to moment. That's all, men at home. I want to chart that. Many of these people were doing that. Premchand was writing about it in all his fictional stuff. So it chooses itself. And the Dalits were the thing that was the addition, and it was very important for me to find another group. And it just so happens that it is the Dalit intellectuals who wrote autobiographies, and this extends it into the late 19th century. Otherwise, this book really was conceptually, it was 1860s, 70s to 1960s, 70s. Because from globalization, from the neoliberal turn onwards, I do think that the Indian middle classes and its dreams and so on and so forth have radically changed. And it would require a very different history to begin to chart that. But a century is enough. There was a lot going on. And it would serve my purposes because, in fact, a lot of what went on then continues now, if in even worse form. That's another matter. So the protagonists chose themselves to that extent. You could say, well, you could have chosen other autobiographies. You could have. How many could I choose in the end? How many do you want to work with? And the only other thing I do want to say, and we'll come to other questions, but I'll come to it in the other questions then. Katyani, have I pronounced that right? Okay. This was a deliberate choice on my part. In part because it is extremely difficult, as I'm saying, to write about India as a whole. In the same way, it is extremely difficult to write about all kinds of men and their activity. I focused on the question of monogamy, and I focused on the relationship between a man and a wife, because this was articulated as the ideal of the modern family in India. And that's why that cover is rather important. That is the photograph taken in 1935, December 35, of a Sharif couple, a police officer's daughter and son-in-law, taken within weeks of the marriage as a marker of this new couple and their life together. The nuclear family. This is the nuclear family. Where are the bride and the groom? I don't know. Those who say. Where? On this side? These two? Yeah, it could be. It would have been okay. As it happens, if you read the book, I've got 2 long footnotes at various places explaining the thing. They are the woman in the middle on the extreme right and the man behind her. Okay? They're tucked away in a corner. Next to the woman, this is in front of the policeman father's home in Aligarh. Next to the bride is his mother and the policeman father. In the middle, who dominates this nuclear family? The elders of the Biradari, the entire community. This is where they come together. This is the nuclear family in India. Till today, conceptually, the 3-generation family is a nuclear family. So that in my home, it was taken for granted. Our parents would live with us. Where else would they go? And that's also true. There was nowhere else for them to go. But it was a total expectation that whatever our units might be, they would have to accommodate this larger family. So the nuclear family must be part of the larger family. Now, conjugality is absolutely critical to the ideal that's being created. These two. And so I focus on the monogamous relationship and the fact that there is a husband and wife, ideally, in thought, in every family, right? Especially in every ideal family. And how do they conduct themselves? What do they say about one another? That was enough of a demonstration. I have in Salim Kidwai and so on, I have extremely close friends who've written about the inheritance of other kinds of sexualities and struggles of marginalized groups and so on and so forth. And in public schools and colleges and what have you, and all sorts of places, prisons, there's a great deal more going on in terms of masculinity and male behavior of various kinds. I couldn't have taken it all on. That's why this unarchiving, if it happens, it's deliberate, but it's one that I knew I was making this choice for the reason that I spelled that out, for that reason. And Ahuna, these are great men at home. That's not true of the Dalit. First of all, most of them write about their parents and grandparents' generation where they were laboring poor in the countryside and they were untouchable. They're now called Dalits. These children, the people who, some of the families, one family in particular, Narendra Jadhav and his family, three generations he writes about. The children, Narendra Jadhav himself, but his older brother, both his older brothers, were well enough educated because of the support of, affirmative action and this and that, whatever else, many things. And because of the drive of the Dalit movement, well enough educated for them to become very, very well-established professionals. Narendra Jadhav becomes a member of the Rajya Sabha. He becomes economic advisor to Sikh Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and so on. And now he's a supporter of the BJP. There are people who move into all sorts of worlds, okay? But it's 3 generations of a remarkable story by people who are writing about the conditions of the oppressed and the struggle to come out, and writing movingly, importantly. So it's not great men there, it's all kinds of other men. But I also want to say the partition and independence generation, the people in between that I write about in one section, they're professionals in the sense that they're an educationist, they're a policeman of this kind. The chap in the top there becomes a great educationist in Pakistan and an ambassador for education, for the spread. But they're professionals of that kind. They're not great men in other ways. They're great men in that they really are continuing to think and continuing to imagine a different society, right? Within that structure. Okay. And what strikes me, and this goes back to Denise's comment, what strikes me is that it runs through many different layers of the society, many different sections where you wouldn't expect it to be running through. I'm a little bit uncertain about the term hypocrisies. I think inconsistencies, contradictions, these things are very real. I'm not sure these people are hypocrites. And, it's a hard thing to say. And, I end the book with the thing of saying, in what way are we complicit? Because part of what's run through my work is our complicity in the histories we exclude, our complicity in the violence of partition, right? Our complicity in the violence against the Sikhs in 1984. Because they were in all our homes, there were suddenly people saying they deserve it. And our complicity in our universities today, what is happening around, right? There's all sorts of things that we do not acknowledge. And one of the things we don't acknowledge is the traces of all of this I talked about. The home is background. Isn't that true in my case? I write about this right at the end. That when my wife's been a very important person in the writing of this book, because she insisted I retain my focus on the men. Keep the women out, she said. Otherwise they'll take over, which is true, because there was a lot of writing about it, right? But nobody pays attention to the men in this domestic space. And she said, just don't let anything distract you from that. Focus on it, stay on it, change the visual, as you're setting out to do. So she's been a kind of she's been a comrade and supporter, my most significant critic and sympathizer, enthusiast, all of that. But that focus was very important. And in that focus, here's the story. We before COVID, we used to go to India every year in the winter, because the one time you could do some work, right? It's one time when people were awake in their offices, not just asleep or not there at all. And a few weeks into our visit to India, she would often say to me, it happened more than once, she said, Gyan, do you miss our home? And I said, no, why would I miss our home? You are here, I'm here. We carry on. She said, I miss it. So, to me, that says something about my treating this as background. It's the place where we live life. But that's not important to life. Whereas for her, that was important. She's nurtured it. She's produced it. She thinks about it. She's responsible for a space and making it a home. Whereas I think we just...
Should we take a few more questions?
Hi, hello. Thank you so much.
Just remind me names one more time.
Avni.
Avni.
Anthropology student as well, second year. My question is how, or I guess, did you question why it is that, I'm sure you did, but do you think it's a question worth sort of pursuing as to why it is that men at home did not perceive their homes as worthy or significant subjects of writing or inquiry, intellectual inquiry in the first place? Like, is that even an appropriate framework? I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking through why it is that it wasn't something that they weren't writing about. And was that important for how you wanted to write about men at home? And perhaps that comes from sort of this like anthropological impulse of this is not important to my interlocutors, but it's important to me as in you in this place as an author or as a scholar to ask these questions. So how do you sort of think through that question? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for the talk and also the book. My name's Tirana. I'm in the history department. Tirana. Yes, thank you. I had a chance to quickly go through the book, and I was struck by the section that appears early on, which is titled Feudality Without Feudalism and on Feudal Values. And I wondered if you could briefly say something about how you've engaged with the concept of the feudal or feudal values across your body of work, starting with some of the books that you mentioned at the very beginning that Vazira invoked, and what it has meant to bring up feudal values in this particular new book of yours. Secondly, I wondered about the languages that you work with. You mentioned in your talk that some things can be said in English, which are not necessarily being said in Hindi or Urdu. And I wondered about your sense of how genre works, or what the possibilities seem to be within the universe of literary production or memoirs and autobiographies in Hindi versus Urdu, to the extent that we can separate them out, versus Marathi. And if there was a world in which you could have written a book where you also thought about post-colonial Pakistan, post-colonial Bangladesh, post-colonial Sri Lanka, like, what's your intuition? Would you end up with very similar tropes that you've written about in this book, or would that look pretty different to the extent that these histories diverge across all these regions of South Asia? Thank you.
Anyone else? Guys?
It's about Jan's work rather than his book, but I'll just let him respond to this again.
Respond to this. Me and
Sure.
Jonas.
Okay. Thank you again for your questions. And all of these questions are important, I do want to say. And, like all my other work, this is just an exploration. The only thing that my work produces is more questions. And I'm pleased. I say in my classes, if we can go away at the end of the semester with more questions, then the class has been a good one. I hope we don't go away with answers, because that really is the end of inquiry. So that's the first response to it. Why didn't men write about the home? And I think you'll know this straight away. I mean, it's clear to me that even the Dalits who move up the ladder very quickly see their place, their real life, as I saw it. We're here. Why do I need that space, right? I write about my real life, the struggles, world history, world conquering events, the things we are doing all over the same. And so the home comes in only as incidental. And so often in many of these things, it comes in as the place you go back to recover when you are ill, the place you go back to rest, the place you go back to when you're demoralized, you've lost a job or you didn't get something you were looking for. And so it's that kind of space of, what should we say, reassurance of, but it's not a place you want to be. It's not where your real life is. That's the way in which many of them function. And as I said, I mean, nobody has referred to it so much. Jagjivan Ram is not a very prominent, he was a very prominent Dalit leader, but because he was not part of the great militant Dalit activity, Jagjivan Ram, his second wife, writes a 3-volume autobiography in which he writes in passing, because this is a really admiring, eulogistic account of his public life, because she believed, just like him, that was his life. Their daughter dies a few months after she's born. He's not there at the birth, he's not there at the death. And he rushes back from his election campaign to comfort her for an hour or two and goes back into the campaign. That's the norm. She writes about it as though, he came rushing and, he said so many nice things effectively. He comforted me and then he had to leave. So in a sense, this is not only men, it's whole generations thinking this is the way world is structured. Men do their work. Right. And that's where the real work is done. And more women should do that. That would be the aspiration. More women should also do that sort of work. And forget about this stuff, this place of the domestic. Even though, as I say repeatedly, they've spent most of their time in that place and they depend on it all of that time. There's no question. I want to just add one more rider. Both Rahul Sankrit and Bachchan, and there must be many others, write at great length about the domestic place. They write about it in detail. And as I say, quite often in further contradictory terms, because they have notions of themselves which don't quite fit the details they're giving, but they provide them. They actually write about them. I don't know if that answers your question adequately. Tirana, the feudality and feudal values, there's an interesting answer to that, which is Ranjit Guha, who was our guru in the sense of being 30 years older than us, that's all. Because he was a wonderful scholar, very, very committed in all sorts of ways. And he said to me when he read my PhD thesis, which was I was finishing when we got together, he said, Gyan, we've been thinking about it, you proved it. He was that kind of scholar. He's always, and he changed his work. He wrote on the physiocrats. He wrote on, permanent settlement, the ideas of colonialism. He changed it to working on the peasants around the time of the Naxalite movement. When he used to be called the Naxal professor when he was visiting Delhi University at that time. Anyway, so we knew about him from then. But when he read this was what it was about. Now, Ranjit, when he wrote his book on elementary aspects of peasant insurgency, a lot of people critiqued him for criticized in print for using feudalism loosely. And he said, look, forget it. I'm not here to talk about feudalism in its classic form. It should be this. The Japanese feudalism doesn't fit. But Japan's a feudal society for some reason. India never had feudalism. Well, anyway, whatever. He says, I know what feudalism is, and that'll do. And to me, the thing was marked because Gayatri uses this phrase, feudality, feudality without feudalism. And it captures something really powerfully. It really does capture. It's like racism without, you don't have to use the word race, right? You can get rid of it. You can have communalism without talking about minorities and majority. That sense of the survival of mentalities that really were mentalities of us and them, of our entitlement, something we were born into. Nobody can question. The women are not born into it. Even they are not entitled. But we, feudal lords, we don't have to talk about feudalism. All there. So those attitudes have persisted all the way through. They come through in quite remarkable ways as well. But they did come through in every other one of my work. The question about different languages and so on, and the genre itself is interesting for all sorts of reasons. Were you there yesterday when we were talking about this? You weren't. I said, I gave two examples of what happens in thinking and writing in different languages. So before I come to genre, I want to just speak about that. I said, I translate a word, or explain, work with a word, which is called Ghar Sansar. And Ghar Sansar is used in certainly all of the North Indian languages, probably in other parts of the country. Literally, Ghar, home, Sansar, world. Home, world. What are you going to do with that? Home hyphenated world. And you can do all sorts of things. It can be rebirth, it can be karma, it can be all sorts of things. But I had to work very hard, write 2 or 3 pages to make some sense of this notion of the world in the home and the home in the world, and their interpenetration, which made it impossible to separate these two, even in the most elite household, let alone in that Dalit. And so, in the Hindi, I don't have a problem. I say Ghar Sansar, right? And most of my audience knows what I'm talking about straight away. I don't have to go any further. They will even know the nuances of it. The fact that at one level, it is about karmic rebirth. And that's part of the notion of Ghar Sansar, that it's built into it, that we are infinitesimal. We are small parts of a much larger cosmos. Genre is another question. It's an interesting one, because when I began to write my book on partition, this came up in a very interesting way. That, Manto has written about this, so-and-so has written about that, so-and-so. Why do you think you want to dig up all of this stuff about violence? Why don't you focus on the progressive, on the things that are changing? And this happened. It was not really our history, right? It's the same argument all over again. But what they said was, the fiction writers, the filmmakers, Bhishma Sani, these people have produced such remarkable statements about what you are trying to write about. Why should you write it as, why should you write this history? And I said, you tell me. The BJP is writing this. They're now telling me, why don't you write history? There's such a demand for history books. Why don't you write some? I've written 11, as it happened. Okay, not all of them. What's describing his books, they're not, anyway, they are whatever they are. But I've been trying to write things. I'm now suddenly being told, why don't you write history? And therefore, it was necessary for us to write that kind of, and recognize this was our history, like it or not. So, genre, it strikes me, it affects things come through differently, all of that will happen. The autobiographical genre is not that of a historian, but we need them all. We need all kinds of statements, all good. It's grist to the middle. It allows us to ask questions, allows us to think questions. Would history, see, look, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, I didn't take on Bangladeshi. I took on what happened in Pakistan because many of these people moved from UP and Madhya Pradesh and so on to Karachi and Lahore. And they wrote about Aligarh as their home when they're in their 80s and about to die. Khurshid Jahan writes about Aligarh, which has always remained my home. But that's something you need to take on, right? So, and these are shared in many ways. There's an Indian ambassador to many different places who's now retired, living in a Muslim, who in a talk I was giving on this discussion of this book, said to me, so you think it's the same amongst Ashraf and Bhadralok today? Which is, I think there's a resonance of that in your question. Is it the same? And I said, look, the rituals, the practices, who you can marry, whom you can't marry, how you should do it, what food you eat, what you must dress, and how you must dress in particular. Obviously, it's not the same. And yet, the shared worlds of respectability and non-respectability, the shared worlds of what women must do and what men must do, the shared worlds of what the working classes are there to do. That's their apportion to. This is shared very, very well. So I don't know how it would come across in Sri Lanka. I don't know how it would come across in Bangladesh. There will be variations of enormous significance. You go to Bhutan, it will be very different. There's no doubt. Go to Nepal, they will be very different. But I'm not writing about everything. I'm just writing about certain things that struck me as significant and worth thinking about.
Denise, do you have a question that you would, as we come to the close of our time, raise?
And we want 5 minutes for anything else you want to ask.
And I have a last.
Actually, I'm going to let you ask, and I'm going to hopefully ask you at dinner.
Of course.
Having to do with secularization and all these axes of difference that run through your work, class and caste being really important, and of course, gender and sex. And I expected more difference between the religion, and that it seemed like the caste differences were more significant in the work as it's presented. So in any case, that's my question answer it now or later. But
it's a good question.
I'm thinking about the question of secularization for modernity, and the way that Talal Asad writes about this. And so just thinking of what the status of secularization is for this.
Let me also ask mine, and then you can answer both, which is, I think what Denise is getting at may resonate with one of my questions, which was, you do put a lot of different figures and narratives together in the thematic chapters, as you laid out so beautifully for us. And obviously that has that effect of erasing some of the differences, the tensions that might be both between religious groups, but also different caste. So that was one of the critiques of Evati Karve's kinship work, which was generally seen as drawing on upper caste Hindu structures of thought, and required other sociologists to come in and do other kinds of work in response to that classic work. But in yours, since you want us to think across these narratives through what they share in common, then I wonder to what extent there is a purpose to that. And there I want to hear you think about the word liberation, which is in the subtitle of your text. And that's in a way where my earlier question is also coming from. If liberation is to be considered as really a very important analytical frame, and this is how I read it, which was to think about anti-colonial struggles and the relationship of nationalisms to that. Is there something in nationalisms, if one thinks about this constant possibility of a radical nationalism that would not be like liberal nationalism, or would not be like, is there a conception, is nationalism so tainted, and so this structure of inequality, the reproduction of certain kinds of violence, so integral to the project of nationalism, that we must therefore think liberation. This is yet another invitation to think or restitute liberation elsewhere.
You saw me holding my head, right? It's only because there's so much in both. But Zira, you've taken it to all sorts of things. And it really would take a lot. It would take an Adda to begin to talk and think about it. I do want to say there's almost inevitably a flattening. There is a generalizing that takes place. There's no doubt about it. And yet I do think that there is a class divide. There is the notion of the respectable and the rest, the hoi polloi and us, chosen people, which runs across this period and across the space. And the Dalits move into it. The Dalits who are successful become middle class, cosmopolitan, international, and so on and so forth. They move. The aspiration is something of the same kind, say, so that our children will never have those. Let's understand. I want to suggest that caste remains and class remains, and gender, discrimination, all of those things remain the unspoken. They are there, and they mark, they shape respectability, such as, for example, this may not have resonances with Canada or the US at all, women must not be seen at all. Now, it is true that royalty has that to some extent, aristocracy in general. Invisibility is part of the power. But it's carried to the point where the woman must not be seen. It was a sign of respectability that your women were not seen. And Baby Kamle writes about her father, who was relatively successful, poor man, a kind of contractor of labor, to build canals and dairies and so on. He's successful enough to beat his wife and ensure she never steps out of the home. That's the kind of aspect. Invisibility is respectability. Okay? Now, once again, there are variations of all kinds and differences within a class and a community and time, within one time, let alone over generations. They're huge changes. But I do want to say about the more general proposition for me. I have to say two things about your questions. One is on nationalism. I'm going to come back to the critique. What can we say about liberation? The first part is, I think, unless I heard you wrong, isn't there a flattening? Isn't there a kind of homogenizing, a generalizing that happens, which then brushes all of these areas with the same brush?
Well, no, that why do that? What's their purpose? Is there a goal? Is something else the hanging fruit, which is liberation?
Well, I suppose that's the answer, but I don't know
the horizon of critique nationalism?
I do want to say that much of what I do is instinctual. So I'm not sure when people say, what was the purpose? I'm not sure about that. I really do want to say that. It is in Subaltern Studies, we said it at one point, not just provable by sources, but instinctively. And I think a lot of this book is about what I instinctively felt needed attention. I can't say better than that, because so it's not a self-conscious working out, this is what I need to address. I do want to say, though, now that you've asked the question, that the answer may well be that there is something, those values, articulations, struggles for respectability or liberation beyond it, that what strikes me about the progressives, thinkers, people who struggled to produce the new India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and Nepal, my apologies, is a desire for the good society, which is very sharply and well defined in terms of that will keep religion to its proper and caste in its proper, which is the book. It happens to be there. We will pass it. Education will solve all of it. We will go way beyond it. And that's why Jinnah's address to the Constituent Assembly in Pakistan, after Pakistan's made, right? That we are now all citizens of this land. We are Hindus, whatever might be here, but we are citizens in public. We are Hindus, etc. In the home. It could have been Jawaharlal Nehru's speech. It could have been Gandhi's. This is a shared sense of liberation. We produce the good society. in which there will be equal rights for all. We will not mention domestic space. Okay? So there is that drive towards a liberation that will include all in this. And I think what a number of people who have responded to this book in ways that I hadn't anticipated anybody would have said, this book turns it inside out, actually opens up the question in a way we had never known. Somebody needed to do that. That's all I'm saying. It struck a chord, and the term inside out was actually used, where it's turned inside out. I felt that was just important, that one can look at another space where people were articulating all the same notions of azadi is a very, very major term. It came back in Delhi in the fight for, the Muslim women's rights to assemble, to survive. Azadi, freedom, azadi is what it's all about. Right? And so it was a huge thing in the domestic sphere. It will be produced. We are fighting for it. Education is going to happen. We will change the world. And the Dalits do it most forcefully, because everybody is doing it. They're all articulating this. And so liberation runs through the rhetoric the whole time. And you may get a Bachchan who lives in some sort of fantasy world where he thinks all the women he ever meets are falling in love with him. Right? He lives in that kind of world. Nonetheless, there's this great articulation of the need for the liberty of all. Azadi, freedom for us all. I too, he says, the feminine in me sometimes is so strong that I know why I did military service. It was a need for my masculine self also to assert itself against my wife, Beji Bachchan, who was a remarkable figure, who gives up, once again, think about what azadi means, freedom means there. She gives up her career. She's a remarkably talented person, and she plays second fiddle all the rest of her life, looking after the children and allowing him to be the great poet and the educationist and so on and so forth. No. It's a sense of azadi that is rife and that requires investigation because its implication and its consequence in different spaces and for different classes, kinds of people, different groups, we haven't attended. I don't know if that speaks to it. Nationalism, last thing. Nationalism, I want to say, and I think many people have articulated this. I've done so from my first book, but certainly very categorically from the second. The critique of nationalism is of the essence to any sense of liberation, because the nation state is an imperialist, and it's always going to. And so we don't have the language. We haven't found those things, but we need to articulate the struggle for freedom, azadi, liberation, with a language that we have to come up with, that I sang last night. You all will provide, because it is now important, it is vital that this struggle conceptualizes, carrying forward. And I do not believe nationalism will provide again. It is very much a fairly marked time of the moment of capital, which we may have even passed. It's kind of post-industrial capital. It's not anything that we understood as capitalism. Where's the working class? Do you need one? When you get all these delivery people falling on the sidewalks, automatons, delivery. We're in another world, and we need to find a language for solidarity, for alliances, for political work in a new environment. It's radically transformed, and I believe that the critique of nationalism, if it wasn't made enough, should be very clear today. when it's come back with such a vengeance in so many parts. It's extraordinary.
I think on that note, thinking with liberation and the kind of new political vocabulary we all need to build, we go and have some refreshments and continue the conversation. Thank you so much. Yeah.